Hello, Deb.
Hi, Holly.
Welcome to Potterwatch.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
Can you tell the students who you are?
My name is Deb Noel, and I'm a senior lecturer in the English department, where I teach a lot of American literature. And I most recently and joyfully teach African-American science fiction and fantasy. I've also done some other science fiction fantasy classes, like I did a dystopia class. While I do not teach YA fiction, I do read it. Not as much now as I used to when my kids were YAs, but read the Harry Potter series as it was coming out, and waiting with much anticipation for each book, and I loved it, despite its author's foibles.
Yes. Deb, can you tell us what question you brought today?
Okay, so my question, because we're here to discuss book 3, which is when I really started liking the series a lot. Previous to this, with book 1 and 2, I was kind of, it's cute, isn't it nice? It's such a cool world that she's built, but I wasn't that compelled by the narrative. Or I didn't find the narrative that compelling until book 3. And so my question for book 3 is, how do the Dementors as a character type change the tone of Rowling's world building? And then related to that is the question of, why did she introduce them in book 3? Like, what's changed about Potter world at this point in the series? Do you want my potential answer, or do you want? Yes. I want to hear your answer too. So, so I think book 3 is the point at which I begin to understand why young adults, younger children and adults all loved the Harry Potter series, because I think it's with book 3 that the narrative becomes sufficiently complex to be engaging to adults. And one piece of that is the introduction of what I consider to be pretty serious moral and ethical dilemmas among our heroes, or especially among kind of the adults in the background behind our heroes, because I think, Harry, Ron, and Hermione are still pretty young, and to a certain degree they're innocents. But the background, the other adults, especially as she develops on the government behind Hogwarts in the wizarding world, the Ministry of Magic, the bureaucracies there, the people who work there, and the kind of entanglements they have with other institutions in that world. That's when I think a lot of ethical problems start to be explored. And that's when it becomes interesting to me. And I think it's a real setup for book 4. So I also have theories about how, in her revising of book 3 and shaping of the narrative in book 3, she's really now decided what she's going to do, at least for the next, book 3 and book 4, through book 4.
Can you say more about the revision of book 3?
So I have this on good authority from my husband, who remembers everything, and remembers waiting for book 3 to come out and realizing that she was a little bit late putting it out. I think she was a full year at least late putting it out. She had initially said she was going to be putting out a book a year. And then you can check on this, but I think there's a little bit more than a year between 2 and 3, because she had a plan for book 3 and then she revised it. And I don't know, that's just a theory of mine that I wonder if, given the popularity of the first 2 books, that was sort of ramping up, and she really realized she had something that she could make, that she had the attention of a good-sized audience, and she had perhaps more freedom because she had more power, as a successful author. I don't know. Something happened between book 2 and 3 where I feel like the story just got more sophisticated. Mm-hmm. The world that she's building got more sophisticated.
There's sort of this legend around Rowling that she had everything plotted out from the beginning, but I think that there's some indication that might not be true. We've just finished talking about book 2, and there's some holes around Horcruxes related to Tom Riddle's diary that make it seem like that was kind of backwards added. And
yeah.
And the Horcruxes is another example of a much darker theme that comes later in the book, and it is sort of a fetch quest of get all the Horcruxes, similar to the sort of MacGuffins of the early books. But it has, you know, this is tone that's quite a bit darker.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, I heard that same story. She had it all written out on napkins initially, and then it was charted out, and she had the whole thing mapped out. But I don't. I mean, I feel like these characters, you know, it's interesting that she's chosen sort of young kids and then she's moving through adolescence with them, because I think the narrative also gains complexity as they get older, and it just becomes less plausible that they would be really satisfied just to go get candy, you know, and sit around and talk about chocolate frogs. That they are going to become more complex as the books progress. And but I think the world behind them, and maybe it's because she's a genius and she wanted to portray them noticing more, like learning more about the world behind them as they get older, as we all do as we get older. But certainly gets more complicated as we move into book 3 and 4.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because they're sufficiently old, you know, at that point. I think they're starting to notice, but I'm not sure they register the moral dilemmas as much as the audience does at this point.
Right, yeah. And there are plenty of moral dilemmas with these Dementors.
Yeah.
They're
terrifying.
Yeah, they're terrifying. And they're sort of bad guys in the service of good guys.
Yeah, they're terrifying as a kind of manifestation of justice, if that's what they're supposed to be. Because they're in the employ of the justice system, or what we would consider to be the justice system in the wizarding world. And yet their purpose, are they a species? Their purpose as a species?
I'm not sure what their sort of categorization is.
Yeah, I mean, they're utilized in a deeply troubling way to mete out justice, when what they actually do is I don't know. Well, maybe there are people for whom that's a kind of version of justice, but to me seems like a kind of perversion of justice because it's torture. So
yeah, I mean, and they're so one thing that I noticed that I was talking to you about is so this was written, it was published just post Columbine, but it's probably written in the years before that. And so it's before we start getting a lot of cops in schools. But to me, the sort of taking prison guards and moving them to a school and having them occasionally visit the Quidditch match when they're not supposed to, and this sort of like really infiltrating the school really reminded me of that sort of like the intention behind having police in schools was to stop these school shootings. We don't necessarily know that that's worked, but we do know that having police in schools has had all kinds of effects on particularly children of color and this sort of school to prison pipeline, and also just terrifying children and creating this this sort of monitoring system. And I feel like that was probably not, obviously timeline wise, that's not what she intended, but it's very hard not to read them in that way now for me.
Well, I wonder also if, so what's the formula in the first 2 books is that there's this safe haven, you know, that Hogwarts is kind of a safe haven, right? And then
it's kinds of dangerous stuff happens.
What now?
Even though dangerous stuff constantly happens.
But let me get, so it's sort of a safe haven, except that it's vulnerable because these people sneak in, they kind of get in there somehow, they wend their way up through the floor, or they come in as a teacher with somebody in their head, you know. So somehow danger sneaks in to Hogwarts, but it's like it's understood as this kind of safe haven that's a safe place for the children because they're protected by Dumbledore, by McGonagall, and that I think she really works with that consistently through the whole series, because you know, if you think about toward the end, spoiler alert for those of you are there any students in the class who haven't read it?
There are a few, but I put spoilers on it.
All right, well, so it's not really a spoiler alert, but it's just that it remains pretty much like, you know, if that's a safe haven. So if it's ever violated, it's kind of alarming and disturbing. But you know, what's interesting to me in this book is that up to this point, it's been sort of the Dark Lord's minions who have made Hogwarts less safe, right? Who are threatening the safety of this sort of safe space. And in this book, it's just an institution associated with the kind of law-abiding, quote unquote, good wizarding world that makes Hogwarts not safe. So I think that resonates with your school cop interpretation of it, where you know, it's very clear that Dumbledore and even I think McGonagall and some of the other teachers really don't want them there, don't feel safer with them there. But the parents and the authorities on the outside, this is their solution to it. So it's this kind of botched solution to a problem that turns out isn't even, properly identified because they're trying to solve the wrong problem.
Right.
So
and they've increased the danger in doing so.
They've increased the danger, and maybe because they're young. I mean, I think it's true that the younger characters do register that the Dementors are a dark force and don't make them feel safer and shouldn't be there. I guess as an adult, I don't know. It's the beginning of Dumbledore struggling with the good guys, like quote unquote good guys outside of Hogwarts. Mm-hmm. And that is still really very much happening in the background, So.
Can we talk about Azkaban?
Sure.
So Azkaban we saw first in book 2 when Hagrid is sent there as a precaution, which is all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then we have Sirius Black, who has spent 12 years in Azkaban, and
wrongfully imprisoned.
And when Harry, sort of puts together what it must be like, Lupin's like, yeah, it's a rock in the middle of the sea, but you don't even need the sea because everyone's basically been tortured.
Yeah.
And gone insane within weeks.
Yeah.
And so the Wizarding justice system, it has these sort of two extremes. It's got all these laws which seem to be mostly unenforceable because they can't keep track of even who's doing underage magic. Is it an elf? Is it Harry? Who really knows? Yeah. But if you are convicted of something, like there's only one real remedy, or one justice, and that is you will go to Azkaban. I'm sure there's fines and smaller things, but we seem to see a disproportionate number of characters being associated with this torture wizard prison.
Yeah.
And that seems problematic.
Yeah, if you're dangerous, right? If you're considered to be dangerous.
You're considered to be dangerous.
Yeah. So it's just, warehousing the dangerous. It's worse than warehousing the dangerous because there's no pretense of rehabilitation or anything like that, or temporary. I guess Hagrid returns from it, but the assumption that Sirius Black, I think part of the dramatic tension about Sirius Black at the end is he sane? Mm-hmm. Will he be able to function? Mm-hmm. And she sort of reassures us with the whole, he's been transforming into a dog, and that's kind of protected him from the Dementors' soul-sucking torture, but I think he remains a little bit unhinged for the duration.
Mm-hmm. And if I think about Hagrid was there for 2 months, and they say that people go mad within weeks. And he's sort of, I think it's a bit hand wavy that he returns and he seems fine. He's still excited to introduce them to Buckbeak and this kind of thing, but he'd have to be deeply traumatized by this.
So it feels like the question then, it feels like Rowling is suggesting in this world that she's built that warehousing people in prison is the wrong response to, right? Is the wrong response.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to think if there's any point in the series where someone's sent to Azkaban and it makes me feel safer. I just think it's like consistently a scary, ethically questionable place. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, there's no rehabilitation. It's entirely sort of retribution. I don't think it works as a deterrent. People are scared of it.
It's a way of starting to build in the question of does the Wizarding world function in a healthy way? Is their government healthy? Are their institutions healthy? Do they know what they're doing in the world beyond Hogwarts, in the Wizarding world? There are so many things that are kind of parallel to our world in terms of their the way their government's set up and their sports and their kind of little downtown hangout areas and their shopping and things like that. And so if this is kind of a parallel to our real world, then it seems as though it's a pretty grim depiction of our prison system.
Yeah. And this predates a sort of 9/11 Guantanamo Bay kind of thing. Which is not to say the U.S. was not doing horrible things before that, but when I think of sort of like island prison, not a lot of supervision,
Yeah.
that's kind of where my mind goes.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like Alcatraz to me, Azkaban. And so that's another island prison.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, and it's interesting making it the island prison that you can't escape from and then saying, but on top of that, we're just going to suck your soul out for good measure, just to make sure that you're pacified, is, you know, it's just a way of describing excessive, morbidly excessive force. So.
And that's on the people who we decided, the society who's decided are guilty. Not even getting to the people who are subject to curfews and armed patrol. I mean, armed because they are in themselves a weapon. Patrols through the streets of Hogsmeade, and that's sort of the effect that has on a society.
Yeah, you're dangerous. We'll send you to Azkaban. I mean, I think, you know, in part, it's good drama, you know, because it's a terrifying place, and the Dementors are a good terrifying monster to add to the story. And maybe by book 3, she's thinking, you know, I've kind of played around with Voldemort in various forms now, and if I keep doing that, things are going to get tired.
This is one of the few books where Harry doesn't have a conflict with Voldemort at the end of the book.
Yeah. And that's why I think this is kind of the beginning of her building out the broader world and the conflict that is not just between sort of good and evil, Lord Voldemort and Dumbledore, but also all of the enablers of Voldemort and the dysfunctioning kind of systems outside of Hogwarts that fail to manage the people that are Voldemort's enablers, right? And how they're very much still around, just not activated. They're like a sleeper cell of of dark wizards that are just kind of out there waiting around.
And I think if we're thinking about our real world, it also points us to the fact that getting rid of the big baddie doesn't necessarily fix the systems that created Voldemort. At the end of this book, you know, Harry's defeated Voldemort. Does the world change? You know, is it fundamentally different than it is at the beginning of the series?
Right. Or is there just a vacuum for someone else to take that place? Yeah. I don't know. It ends. Kind of ends.
Yeah.
I was also thinking about, you know, this is a totally different question, but I was also thinking about her use of, and I wanted to know what you think of the time turner as a plot device.
Time turner just bothers me because it's one of those things that's introduced in one book, and a couple books later, I'm like, whatever happened to that time turner?
That is the problem, right?
You can't introduce a time turner. Like, at least the Sorcerer's Stone, they destroy it.
Right.
The time turner, she returns it to McGonagall, puts it back in a cupboard. Like, what happens to the time turner?
Yeah, why not destroy it or have some kind of, you know, reckoning that it should have been used that way and must be put away for, you know, forever.
It remains that everything that they do almost like has no teeth because it could all be turned back.
Yeah, I remember thinking when I read this book the first time, like, oh no, she went there, because as soon as you go there, that's a device that you have in your quiver, you know, and if you don't pull it out, then nothing really matters anymore. But so many science fiction fantasy narratives use that device. And it can be really problematic simply because nothing seems to matter after that point anymore. And it's really interesting, you know, I don't want to spoil, but other things that happen later on in the series that people think, oh, that couldn't possibly have happened. That doesn't really happen. You know, she's going to fix that, right? And she comes out with, no, those kinds of things happen, and you can't just change them. You must deal with them. Not if you have a time.
We all know in the back of our mind that we do have a device that could fix that.
Yeah. So that's problematic.
Yeah.
But that was the less interesting question that I thought about.
Still a good question.
Dementors are a much more interesting question. Yeah. And I love the Patronus as a kind of as a sort of a good guy weapon, because it's an expression of confidence, and I really like how she's able to get Harry to wield it in a way that's not overly sentimental, even though it's incredibly emotionally moving, you know, at the end. So as far as introducing new devices, the Tempter, that's been done before, and I think it's problematic, but the Patronuses I really like, because it's kind of cool to have an avatar, first of all. It's always cool to have an avatar. And
do you have a Patronus, Deb?
You know what? That's a good question. I think my Patronus is a cat. I think it's a calico cat. And yeah, I really like cats' indifference to humans. That's what I like especially about them. So I would have a cat.
Cat suit you. And you
I would have a cat that'd be like, don't bother me right now half the time. It would be kind of a pain in the butt.
Cat versus Dementor is a battle I'd like to see.
Cat versus Dementor. Yeah. So I'm trying to think. I really do like the introduction of the character of Sirius Black, because I think it's cool to have an adult who's not a teacher at Hogwarts, who seems to kind of gain some sort of permanence as a potential main character in the background, and also who's connected to Harry's story, so can help kind of flesh that out, the story of Harry's parents. So he serves a couple of different functions that I think are good in the overall story. In the overarching narrative. I don't know. What do you like about book 3?
I mean, I do really like Lupin. He is.
Yeah, we didn't talk about Lupin yet.
We didn't talk about Lupin. So Lupin, I mean, I read this as an adult, as you did. And I also read this in the vacuum of queerness that exists before J.K. Rowling magically makes Dumbledore queer. And so to me, Lupin is incredibly queer-coded. And she has talked about how, his werewolf condition is supposed to be a metaphor for HIV, which a lot of people have said is problematic sort of metaphor. But even absent that, I really do read him as queer. And he's a competent teacher. He's one of the very few competent teachers that we see at Hogwarts, which seems to function with a very minimal sort of oversight and maximum sort of instructor independence. And so yeah, I think Lupin is probably my favorite part of. I mean, and he's not even a magical element. He's just a really good character.
Yeah, and he's actually a character that helps to develop. I like that she develops Dumbledore, who's a really important character, but develops Dumbledore through the relationships that he's had over the years. Through the sympathy that he shows people that he's known over the years. And so Dumbledore's very much in the background of this book, but the fact that he's hired Lupin and put this trust in Lupin when no one else will do that makes a cool sort of background development of Dumbledore. But I agree. I really like Lupin. I mean, he's the teacher who lets them, he's like, lets them practice, like gives them practical experiences. He doesn't,
but doesn't do the Lockhart version where he's just like, pixies, sort them out.
Yeah.
Demonstrates how to do it.
Really thoughtful, because he's paying attention to them and what he thinks they might need. I was rereading the Bogart, or maybe I was listening in my cassette tapes to the first lesson, which is the Bogart lesson, and it always makes me nervous whenever Neville is kind of put on the spot in a class, because Neville does not thrive when he's put on the spot in a class, and I think he simultaneously embarrasses Neville, but also provides a space for Neville to do something well, to kind of, so the net effect is that Neville, I think, walks away with improved self-esteem and also a sense that he can kind of fight his own demons. And yeah, so I agree that he's a good teacher, partly because he's giving them practical things to do, but also because he's paying attention to them. I think he pays attention to what they need and who they are, rather than kind of, we've seen a succession of teachers who are all ego, and he's not.
He's got very little ego. Yeah,
I like that a lot.
Yeah.
And the kind of subtlety of the image of the moon and this potion that he has to take to keep him, healthy and things like that. It's a good vehicle for Snape to kind of be involved, but also potentially be problematic, later on.
Yeah. And Lupin has this sort of ethical quandary going on in the background of he knows, this information about Sirius that he's not sharing, because even 12 years later, he doesn't quite believe that Sirius could have done this.
Yeah, and he's got the kind of lingering fear that he himself will lose control and will hurt somebody.
Mm-hmm.
So he's pretty sure he's not dangerous, but not 100% sure that he's not dangerous and shouldn't be at the school.
Mm-hmm.
So he's kind of a danger that Dumbledore introduces because he thinks it's under control and he trusts him.
Mm-hmm.
But then we sort of also rely on Snape giving him an effective potion as he's
and not sabotaging that, even though Snape has his suspicions, which is another sort of ethical thing for Snape.
Yeah, but you know what? That is an interesting thing, because it's like it's already at that point that, and I don't remember whether this is happening in book 2 or 1, but like Dumbledore's giving and okaying responsibilities for Snape that if he were just a kind of starkly evil character, obviously wouldn't do, right? So,
although he does have a really questionable record with Quirrell and Lockhart.
Yeah.
And to be honest, Hagrid.
Snape?
No, I mean the Dumbledore's hiring practices are not batting 100 or 1,000, not batting 1,000.
Yeah, he introduces risks.
Mm-hmm. He's pretty significant risks.
Yeah, he's definitely introducing significant risks. Do you think that's because he feels that he whatever befalls them, he can control it, he can manage it?
I mean, I think that's part of it. I do think also in my class we've talked about this, whether he's using Hogwarts as a trap in some of these instances. We're not sure if Hogwarts' primary function is to be an educational institution.
Yeah, or it's a training ground for people like Harry.
A training ground, a sort of military, pseudo-military thing, and also in some cases a trap. The first book I think that he has the stone there as a trap. And in the second book, does he can't possibly have failed to see through Lockhart. So if he hasn't, is he having there so he can expose him?
Mm.
And if he is doing that, then I hope his motives are not the same for Lupin.
Yeah, let's not ask J.K. Rowling, because she'll come up with an answer that we don't want.
I don't want that.
We can speculate ourselves. That's interesting. Well, I mean, if he himself is engaged in these kind of maybe unethical things, is it because this is his domain and that's really the only domain in which he can fight his battle against the forces of evil? You know what I mean? Like
Dumbledore could have been Minister of Magic if he wanted to.
Yeah, but there's too many complications there. He wouldn't have. This is like his little fiefdom. Like he sort of has control over this.
Yeah. Especially
since probably the next powerful wizard down is Snape, and he's got Snape under his thumb, basically.
Yeah.
So, I've always thought of him as he's there because he likes the job, but also because that keeps him, at least from book 3 on, he seems to want to be actively like avoiding the Ministry of Magic and all that stuff outside of Hogwarts. He can control better the things that go on in Hogwarts, even though, as he said, it's a kind of controlled chaos at times.
Yeah.
What was that?
Well, that is 5 o'clock. So
ooh,
let's leave it here. Thank you, Deb, for joining us on Potterwatch.
You're welcome.